This is the dungeon of Norwich Castle, where prisoners were held, were tortured, and often died. And if ghosts exist, and many people believe they do, then this is the kind of place where you'd expect to become aware of them. Their spirits still here in the stones. But spirits can also be associated with quite ordinary places and things, or so some people believe. And in this programme, we're going to explore some of them. East Anglia is very much a hidden world of the kind which spirits seem to inhabit. St Benet's Abbey, for instance, in the village of Ludham on the edge of the East Norfolk marshes, is a case in point. This ancient gatehouse is all that's left standing of a great abbey built 1,000 years ago to house literally hundreds of monks. And it's the kind of place where writer Joan Forman claims she can literally feel the presence of the past.
I think there are certain kinds of place which produce hauntings, or perhaps it is that they retain hauntings. I think hauntings are all over the place, they're generalised, but rural areas do seem to retain hauntings longer than cities. Particularly, I suppose, because rural areas are less disturbed. Therefore, any historical event that's taken place, not necessarily a historical event either, is less likely to be fractured by modern life, by traffic noises, by pulling down and building up.
And East Anglia has the dubious honour of being associated with one of the most tragic figures in British history, Mary, Queen of Scots. Forced to flee from Scotland in 1568 by rebels, she sought refuge in England in the hope of some support from Queen Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth saw her as a threat to her own throne and kept her prisoner, incredibly, for 18 years. This mound at Fotheringhay in Northamptonshire is all that's left of a castle which once stood on this spot. 400 years ago, it was the last of several prisons to contain Mary, Queen of Scots. In fact, she spent the last 6 months of her life here before finally being found guilty of plotting against the English crown. Queen Elizabeth I, her cousin, signed her death warrant, and on the 8th of February 1587, on this spot, she was beheaded. But that was not the last that was heard of Mary, Queen of Scots. Here in the town of Oundle, just a few miles from Fotheringhay, is an ancient coaching inn called the Talbot, which contains some very interesting artefacts in its structure. In 1626, just 39 years after Mary had been executed, stones and building materials from Fotheringhay Castle, which had by now been demolished by King James of England, who in fact was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, such are the laws of royal inheritance, these building materials were brought here to Oundle to help modernise the Talbot Hotel. And among the things that were brought here was that leaded window and the oak staircase behind it. And it seems that the spirit of Mary, Queen of Scots, may have come with them. The staircase is said to be the one down which Mary walked to her execution, and the window the one through which she would have seen the Northamptonshire countryside during her final imprisonment. So this would presumably account for the sightings which there have been of what is presumably Mary's ghost coming down these stairs.
It's obviously associated with the staircase or the window, but I suspect it's the staircase, and I think it's one particular part of the staircase. Having gone over it fairly carefully this morning, there is one part that seems to be strongly atmospheric, to use the nearest word one can use, and that is the wicket gate. I put my hands on that wicket gate this morning, and the rest of the staircase is perfectly innocuous. There's nothing there, it's just wood. But there is something about that wicket gate, the nearer one is to it, and the closer the contact with it, the stronger the feeling of distress and despair. It is very strong indeed. There are some people who can pick this kind of thing up.
And Joan Forman certainly seems to be such a person. As she touched the stair rail and looked through the window, she seemed to experience the same emotions that must have been present at Mary's execution.
The emotional pitch of everybody concerned in that last morning, that last walk down these stairs, must have been intense. Can you imagine it, going to your own execution and seeing the block at the bottom waiting for you? A woman with a longish life for that particular period in time, and knowing that in 5 minutes it was going to come to an end. Intensely emotional. I don't quite know how her ladies-in-waiting dealt with it. There is said to have been very much distress on their part because they were fond of her. They'd been with her for many years. And there was much weeping, obviously. But I think the Queen herself did not weep. She was a strange woman. A woman of great emotional depth. She never had quite the intellectual control which her cousin Elizabeth had. Perhaps this is why one survived and the other didn't.
Meanwhile, downstairs, the business of the Talbot Hotel goes on, with only a few of the guests fully aware of the dramatic and historic associations upstairs. But some of the staff who have worked at the hotel for years have vivid recollections of their brushes with the spirit of the Scottish Queen.
I came at 6:30 one early, January morning, and came in the bottom gate, went to unlock the door, and happened to glance up at the yard, and just, halfway up the yard, there was this figure in white, or creamy colour, and I thought, the manager's wife's out early this morning. And as I looked at it, it started to glide down the yard, and I remembered that the manager's wife weren't even here, they were abroad. And I didn't know where to run to, whether to run to the butcher next door or in the hotel. Anyway, I ran in the hotel and shut the door quick and locked it, and I wouldn't go out to fetch any papers or, to take with the early morning tea. And, really was very frightened about it. And for weeks after, my husband had to bring me to work and come in with me.
Next, a tale of Suffolk smugglers. 100 years ago, the rough, tough seafarers of the Suffolk coast were renowned for the way they outwitted the excise men. It was almost a respectable profession, in fact, and certainly seemed to receive the cooperation, if not the blessing, of men of the cloth. But as you might expect, the centre of the smugglers' operations was often a pub.
There's pretty strong historical evidence that the Queen's Head here at Blyford was once the headquarters of a gang of smugglers in liquor. They used to ship the barrels up the little river down the road there, carry it up the road and straight down into the cellar under the pub. There's even a trapdoor alongside the building where they used to shove it down right quick. But if, as often used to happen, the excise men came to call to try to catch the culprits, they used to take the barrels and put them down a tunnel under the garden, then under the road, and further under the graveyard there, and into the church and into the crypt. And of course churches couldn't be raided, and so with the permission of the parson presumably, once they were in the church they were safe.
Or, as Rudyard Kipling put it in his poem about the subject, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. And there's little doubt that the smugglers got lots of favours from such people in return for a few illicit goods. And it doesn't take a very vivid imagination to visualise the small boats which would ferry the liquor or the tobacco to the shore from sailing ships anchored out at sea. Only the locals could find their way across the mud flats and up the maze of farm roads hidden by high hedges, or perhaps by even smaller boats along creeks and tiny rivers. And almost always in areas like this, there were stories of a big black dog. Some enormous creature with big red eyes and a slobbering mouth, which was guaranteed to frighten anybody of a nervous disposition. In any event, a lot of the illicit liquor almost certainly ended up here, in the cellar of the Queen's Head at Blyford. Back in the smugglers' days, the excise men knew pretty well what went on, and from time to time would decide to raid the place to see if they could catch the smugglers red-handed. They'd come late at night, and approaching as quietly as they could across the gravelled yard, they'd attack with all the force of the law behind them. And the ghostly sounds of that happening have been heard many times by landlords and customers alike.
Sitting here in the bar, drinkers have also been known to see flashing lights and hear noises coming from upstairs. Noises perhaps of smugglers and the excise men having a running battle. They've even been known to hear the sound of pistol shots. But when the source of the sounds has been investigated, there was nobody there.
The sounds have been heard by dozens of people, sometimes by whole groups of them when the pub has been full. Relief barman Jonathan Sherm was terrified when he first heard them.
Yeah, well, it's the first time I looked after the pub, and I was hoovering down here, and all of a sudden I heard this bang, bang, bang upstairs, and I thought, good Lord, that's a bit strange. I mean, this time of day, you know, no one was there, and so I went upstairs to check, you know, to see if there's a dog got in or something, because the door was open, actually. And I went up there, no one there, so I came downstairs and immediately grabbed a scotch off the shelf, because I realised that it was something very odd, you know.
But wasn't there a possibility that he might have been mistaken, that the sounds were made by something quite ordinary, for which there was a rational explanation?
The heavy footsteps are so heavy, it couldn't be anything else. I mean, it couldn't be a dog, couldn't be a child or anything like that. It'd have to be a fully grown man with boots on to make that sort of noise. It really is very loud. You can hear it, and I heard it 3 times now. You can hear it on a busy Saturday night when there's hundreds of people in here, and smoke and music loud and everything else. And you can hear it upstairs, you know, even in that. It's quite extraordinary, it really is.
There was a battle between smugglers and excise men in that pub at Blyford, and it was sufficiently violent to generate, I imagine, extremely high emotion, fear and anger and perhaps hatred in the people concerned. And when you get violent emotion produced in individuals, it seems to accentuate the electromagnetic field which all human beings produce. I mean, we are electrical animals, and the field, the electrical field which human beings produce, can be measured and photographed.
Landlord and landlady at the Blyford Queen's Head at present are John and Annette Hales. In fact, they only took the pub very recently.
Would it have made any difference to whether you came or not if you'd known the full story about all the noises and things?
Not really. I mean, luckily we didn't hear many until we'd actually got here. About
that sort of thing doesn't bother you too much?
No, I don't let it really. We've got to live here, so...
And there may certainly be a natural explanation for the stories about the black dog. Significantly, they almost all originate in areas where a bit of law-breaking went on. It's highly likely, therefore, that the tales were put about by smugglers and the like to frighten others away while they were about their nefarious business.
Come on, that's it, come on. Good boy. There's a good boy.
The town of Louth in Lincolnshire is a place so full of fascinating history that it would be surprising if there weren't some hauntings associated with it. Certainly this house, Thorpe Hall, on the outskirts of the town, is one of the most famous haunted houses in Britain. The story concerns a Spanish lady of the 16th century who apparently wore green and has consequently come to be known as the Green Lady. Her romantic story was beautifully recorded by a 19th century occupant of the house. But the spirit of the Green Lady has been around much more recently than that, as Joan Forman, herself a native of Lincolnshire, explained.
I remember my grandfather telling me about people who had actually seen the Green Lady. And as recently as about 20 years ago, I talked to a vicar of one of the local villages who had been driving along the road outside the hall on a very wet day. And he saw this woman in green walking in front of him, and her dress billowing out in the wind. He wound the window down to ask her more or less what she thought she was doing, only to find that there was nobody there. There was nothing except the empty, rain-blown road. And then he realized one particular point, that The dress he'd seen billowing up was perfectly dry. Then, of course, he understood what he'd seen.
Clearly an intriguing story and worthy of further investigation. So, to try to learn more, I called to see the present residents of Thorpe Hall, Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell? Hello. Good afternoon.
Sir John Ball, the owner of this house and the local hero, was captured in Spain during the Spanish Elizabethan Wars and was imprisoned. And this lady passed his dungeon daily, took pity on him and eventually fell in love with him.
This was a Spanish noble lady,
This was a Spanish noble lady. Her name is thought to have been, now I must get this right, Donna Leonora Oviedo. And in time, she managed to bribe his jailers with some of her jewels and supplied the rest of her jewels to Sir John to enable him to get back to Britain. But she badly wanted to come back with him and pleaded to be taken.
She had developed an affection for him, I take it.
Oh, more than that. She was very much in love with him, but she couldn't live without him. But he told her, very honestly, that he was married, happily, and had children, and there was no room for her in his life. So, sadly, they parted. Afterwards, she found that the not being able to live without him bit was literally true for her. And she boarded a ship and she came to England. And she came to Louth and she came up the drive to Thorpe Hall.
Visitors to the house today may know nothing of its reputation nor of the Green Lady. But those who know the story can hardly fail to be caught up in the emotion that dates back 400 years to that walk up the drive. Hoping that Sir John Ball might be free to return her love in spite of what he told her, the Green Lady came towards the house. Quietly she approached the lighted windows. But inside she saw a happy family group and realized the hopelessness of her situation. Without a word, she walked back to the foot of one of the great trees in the garden and killed herself. The spirit of the Green Lady has been associated with Thorpe Hall ever since. But its present owners, the Mitchells, rather enjoy her spiritual presence.
Yes, well, it's described as a very happy house, a house that was loved, apparently. And we feel the same about it.
Yes, we feel very comfortable in the house. It's a house which we quickly got used to living in. Very pleasant ambience, I think, in the house.
The something here has always been something here. Whether there still is, I don't know, because these things fade. After a time, they lessen.
And the fact that she hasn't been seen for 20 years, I mean, does this mean that maybe this spirit has left this place?
Died away, I think. Gone elsewhere, perhaps.
One of the most fascinating stories of hauntings concerns a certain Miss Henrietta Nelson. Miss Nelson, who died here at Yaxley Hall in Suffolk on April the 4th, 1815, had apparently lived here all her life, but because she was illegitimate, had occupied a rather inferior position. The lack of two identifiable parents was regarded as a shameful thing for the child in the 19th century. In any event, Miss Nelson loved Yaxley Hall, and during her life she requested that when she died, she should be buried in the grounds. Her death was in fact sudden and resulted from injuries sustained after falling down a flight of stairs. As she'd requested, her body was buried in a vault in the grounds, and nothing more was heard of her for many years. Then new owners bought Yaxley Hall, and knowing nothing of the history, had the vault removed and Miss Nelson's burial place demolished. Soon afterwards, the ghost of Henrietta Nelson was seen in the grounds. Later, it came to be associated with a portrait of her painted while she was alive. present owner of the portrait is Mr. Brian Hall, who lives at Banningham Rectory in Norfolk. Mr. Hall is a collector of all kinds of antiques and historic memorabilia, but he undoubtedly has a special affection for the portrait of Henrietta Nelson, not least because of a startling quality which he claims the picture possesses.
The fact that her face changes in the actual pigment. I mean, some days she's quite benign, and other days she's quite cross and irritable. One thing she does love is a sherry party, and as soon as the people have arrived and they are enjoying themselves, we look up at Miss Nelson, and she's absolutely happy.
You're really serious about it?
Oh, yes. Yes, her face actually changes.
Well, I don't think it's changed since I've been holding the picture here. It looks more or less the same. But
yes.
You've actually seen it change, haven't you?
Oh, many times, and many visitors to the house. And then, of course, she also follows her picture. I've seen her twice at Barton Turf, where we were living when I first acquired this portrait in the early 50s.
You mean you've seen her ghost?
Oh, yes. And at Smallborough, but only once here since we moved here in 59.
But under what circumstances?
Well, as I say, I acquired this portrait at the Hepworth Hall sale in the early 50s. And having cleaned the painting, it was hanging in our drawing room. And I went over to the church at Barton Turf one evening to lock up. And coming back and looking up at the west window, there looking out at me was Miss Nelson.
Are you sure you didn't mistake it for a trick of the light or whatever?
Not at all. Strange things do happen to me, and this happens to be one of them.
Has anybody else around here seen her?
Oh, yes. There's Fred Bartle in the village saw her in the bedroom above this room, which we call the Wanley bedroom, when we had the house open for charity.
Yes, when we have opening days in here, I look after the room, and one day there was nobody in the room whatever. And I took up a book, like you said, to read there, and I suddenly thought there was somebody here. And I looked round there and saw this lady stand there looking at that oil painting. And I looked back again, and I thought to myself, well, I didn't hear her come in. And when I looked back again, she was gone. And I thought to myself, I didn't hear anybody come in. And that was that.
Were you frightened at all when you saw her looking out of the picture?
No, I wasn't frightened at all.
Just to show me how she stood there,
and I've been hoping to find her again, and I wouldn't take my eyes off on her next time. She just stood there looking at that picture there like that.
And then when you looked again, she was gone?
Yes, she was gone.
Brian Hall shares his fantastic Aladdin's cave of a house with fellow antique fanatic Sheila Day.
When I first knew that I was going to actually come and stay here, I thought really she might rather resent my presence, because it was obvious that she was very fond of Brian. And so I was dusting or cleaning out this room, and I looked at her portrait, and I talked to her, and I explained that I was coming, and I hoped that she wouldn't mind. And I've always rather felt that her face, when I look at her portrait, is rather softened. She actually has a very sweet face.
And Brian Hall himself is delighted to have seen Henrietta Nelson here at Banningham Rectory in most unexpected circumstances.
Telephone bell was ringing in the back hall. I came tearing up this passage, and just about here, I thought it was a draped curtain, but I knew we hadn't got such a thing by the dining room door, and I looked. In a split second, I realized what it was, or who it was. It was our friend Henrietta Nelson. This startling face, which I had seen on 3 previous occasions, one longed to stop and hold a conversation, but the bell was still ringing, and I rushed along and thought, this has made my evening. She was the last person I was thinking about at that particular moment, and I hadn't seen her at Banningham before, although I had felt her presence here, I mean, almost daily. But this is the first, and up to the present time, the last appearance of Miss Nelson.
Whether you believe in spirits or not, people like those we've talked to in this programme are totally convinced. What's more, most who believe they have experienced something or other aren't really alarmed by it. and there are few areas in Britain where there are more believers than in the hidden world of East Anglia.